Thank you, Chair, and thank you for your kind words. And also thank you for the excellent organization of this event. I was receiving insistent emails from your collaborators. Will I be using some PowerPoint? I hasten to say that I will not be using a PowerPoint. I don't do that ever since before another conference. I was asked by the organizers, are you going to use a PowerPoint or do you have anything to say? So ever since I avoid using the PowerPoint. And in any case, my eyes will be riveted to this huge intimidating clock where my 15 minutes are melting. So I think I'll get down to what I want to say. And the first thing I want to say is that I would like to thank Dr. Boaz Ganor for inviting me to this 13th International Conference. I'm very honored to address this distinguished audience today on behalf of the Council of Europe. The Council of Europe was set after the Second World War in 1949 to safeguard and promote democracy, respect for human rights and the rule of law as a way, this is what our founding fathers believed, that was the way to avoid the horrors of the war from happening again. The Council of Europe, therefore, the Council of Europe's approach to counterterrorism is based on three elements. First, it is possible and it is imperative that counterterrorism is put in practice, measures, and terrorism is fought in full respect of human rights, rule of law, and democracy. Second, it is very important to promote cooperation in judiciary matters because counterterrorism is international and because prosecution, investigation, prosecution, and punishment must be vigorous and efficient. And third, it is also important to address issues such as non-discrimination, protection of minorities, intercultural dialogue, all these things which, if neglected, may be conducive to terrorism. When I was preparing my statement, I read again through as many as I could of what we have as conventions in treaty law. We also have what we call soft law, recommendations of our Committee of Ministers and other resolutions and declarations. We have, of course, the case law of the European Court for Human Rights, and there are three very salient points which emerge for me. One is that all the wise words about counterterrorism have been said already before and especially after 9/11. No, nothing justifies terrorism. Yes, terrorism can be fought in respect of human rights. Yes, there must be international cooperation, and so on. So all the wise words have been said, but perhaps not every wise action has been taken. And the reason for this state of affairs is that the second point, which was obvious for me, was that acting to counter terrorism has always been and remains a difficult, very fine balancing act of reconciling strong, robust counter-terrorism measures with full respect of human rights and the rule of law. And that means collecting and processing personal data while respecting privacy. That means suppressing apology of terrorism while respecting freedom of expression. That means giving terrorist defendants an adversarial trial with equality of arms while respecting the dignity and protecting the victims, and so on and so on. So it's very difficult, and it's a continuous effort which requires new solutions, which requires constant attention. And the third point is that the rules, best practices, and lessons learned in that balancing act are under constant and disruptive pressure, not only because terrorists will change their tactics and invent new ways of committing terrorism, but also as a result of the new technological developments, especially in the area of sensor and communication development, computing power, and what we are observing today is a quantum leap in the capacity to correlate and analyze big data. So, Today, my proposition is to very briefly present the Council of Europe action against terrorism with these 3 points in mind, and give you a little more detail on some of our instruments where Israel has expressed an interest to join. I must say that Israel is an observer state to the Council of Europe. For those who do not know, Israel takes an active part in one of our conventions against money laundering and terrorism financing, which you mentioned, and also in a number of other areas. Now, as a human rights watchdog, in the 70s, the Council of Europe was the first to point out the link to democracy. Fighting terrorism is indispensable for preserving the democratic structure, democracy. Next came, I mentioned that, the idea very forcefully that nothing justifies terrorism. Under any circumstances and in any culture, terrorism is not to be justified. This may sound very obvious today. It was not so in the 70s. In the 70s, there were a lot of indigenous terrorist acts in Europe, which were committed in the name of various political causes. And that is why the first convention of the Council of Europe, which was adopted in 1977, sought to add terrorist offenses to those already defined in international law, which could not be treated then as political offenses. That was at the time hijacking of aircraft, kidnapping, using indiscriminate violence. So those could not be considered as political offense and could not be an obstacle to extradition. So in this way, the Council of Europe was seeking to reinforce the principle of extradite or prosecute. And in parallel, in the 70s, the Council of Europe began focusing on making international judicial cooperation simpler, more expeditious, improving the exchange of information between competent authorities for the purposes of investigating and prosecuting and adjudication terrorist offenses. That is something which has proven very difficult because of different legal systems, and it is a continuing work today. We have a special body which is called a Special Committee for the Operation of our Conventions, and they invent or they constantly work, they do incremental work on devising forms and ways to help practitioners cooperate more efficiently. Now, after 9/11, and I think we all agree that 9/11 changed the way terrorism was perceived and looked at, there was a kind of divide between those states who declared war on terror and the majority of the European states and the Council of Europe as an organization, which continued to believe, and we do so to this day, that terrorists are common criminals and should be dealt with as such, and should be dealt with by the means of common criminal law and not be made combatants or martyrs or anything else. Now, we, at that time, there was an international effort in the United Nations, but also in the Council of Europe in 2003 to 2005 to draft a comprehensive international convention against terrorism, which proved to be an elusive goal, not only at the universal level, but even at the European level for a number of reasons, which I will not go into now. So the result of this Council of Europe effort was our Convention on the Prevention of Terrorism, which establishes a number or asks its parties to criminalize a number of offenses which may lead to terrorism, such as apology, propaganda of terrorism, such as recruitment and training for terrorism, and some others. That convention led to modification of additional protocols to some of the existing mutual legal assistance instruments. So I think that convention has helped create in Europe a situation which is more conducive to prevention, but also investigation and prosecution of terrorist offenses. Now, at the same time, as you may remember, because that made at the time was widely covered in the news, a Council of Europe body called the Parliamentary Assembly was very active in making political pressure against the United States for their program of extraordinary rendition. And as it turned out, quite a few member states of the Council of Europe had participated in that program. At the time, I remember they were all denying, including ambassadors, were making speeches in the Committee of Ministers of the Council of Europe, how that was not possible. But in the end, well, they had to admit, and now measures are being taken that this will not happen again. Now, this shows that where it comes to human rights and respect for rule of law and democracy, the Council of Europe stands very firm. We have a body of case law of the European Court of Human Rights with very specific elements for those who are students of law or advanced interest in law. I would recommend to look into the case law of the court. And also we have a body which is called the Consultative Council of European Judges, and they adopted an opinion in 2006 on the role of the judges in the protection of the rule of law and human rights in the context of terrorism, which is very interesting as it goes into considerable detail of various legal concepts and how they can be applied in fighting terrorism. Now, Israel has expressed an interest to become a party to the Convention on the Prevention of Terrorism. This convention will give Israel a number of advantages. Israel already participates in the Committee of Experts Against Terrorism, which is called Codex there. But being party to the convention will allow Israel to participate in the mechanism of the monitoring of that convention, which started very recently. The first round will conclude very soon with a report on what measures, what are the best practices, what is the legal framework, and what measures states take to combat recruitment of terrorism. And there will be a next, that's Article 6, a next round on Article 7, and so on. Now, I must say that there is a lot remains to be done. One of the reasons that a comprehensive instrument against terrorism is difficult to draft is that it's difficult to foresee what will happen in the future. When the Council of Europe was adopting measures against hijacking of aircraft, little did they know that one day aircraft would be flown into buildings. When they adopted the measure or asked the states to criminalize recruitment and training for terrorism, they overlooked passive training for terrorism. It's a crime to recruit somebody for terrorism, but it's not a crime to go to Afghanistan and undergo training for terrorism. And that is something that probably we will be looking into in the future. Now, Israel has also expressed an interest to become a member of a number of other conventions which are not directly related to terrorism, trafficking in human beings, right of children, violence against women, cybercrime. Cybercrime, we have a convention where Israel has been invited to accede in April this year, 2013, and being invited to accede means that a substantial preliminary work has already been done. So I very much hope that Israel will be able to join, and that's for the moment the only legally binding international instrument on cybercrime. I will be finishing because the big clock is just terrorizing me. I will finish by saying, if I have to wrap up, I have to say that the Council of Europe stands for respect for human rights when combating terrorism. And to make the point, I want to draw your attention to a recent publication. It is of end of 2012, Counter-Terrorism and Human Rights in the Case Law of the European Court of Human Rights, which I am very happy to donate for the benefit of the library of your school chairman.